So, to present this year's Leveson Lecture at what I think we all agree is a pivotal moment for British politics, but also I think a pivotal moment for British journalism, please welcome broadcaster and best-selling author, James O'Brien.
Thank you very much. It's the first time I've been described as a best-selling author. I think I could get used to it. And thank you all for coming. My preparation this evening probably hasn't been perfect. I've just been sitting there running through all the reasons why I shouldn't have accepted this invitation. I don't think anyone should ever be exposed to their own face magnified starters. The second thing that occurs to me, especially given the scrupulous impartiality that Hacked Off adopts towards Brexit, is that the title of the speech rather presumes a degree of consensus. Democracy is in crisis, but one presumes that half the country still think it isn't. And the reason why Brexit has all gone so badly is because Gary Lineker and Woody Allen keep being so mean about it. The other reason why perhaps I shouldn't have accepted this invitation, I'll give you a warning in advance, is that I've got a very tickly throat at the moment, known in the trade as a touch of the Teresas. So, if events do become unbearable, then you can all fight among yourselves over who gets to play the role of Philip Hammond and bring me across. But I think the most important reason why I shouldn't have accepted this invitation tonight is because I don't think my late father would be very impressed. My late father, who passed away 6 months after Hacked Off was founded, was a proper journalist. He left school in about 1955 at the age of 15 with no O-levels, and because the editor of the local newspaper, the Shipley Times and Express on the outskirts of Leeds drank in my grandmother's pub, he managed to secure a month's unpaid, what we call now work experience, but what I suspect was called then something rather less euphemistic. In a nutshell, he had a month to make sandwiches, run the tea errands, possibly do a tiny little bit of copy boy duties, and at the end of that period, hopefully, he would be offered some sort of wage to carry on doing some sort of job, and thankfully he was. So that was 1955, the Shipley Times and Express. There followed a journey that will be utterly unfamiliar to most modern-day journalists, including myself, because he then went on a tour of northern regionals, morning papers, evening papers, the Doncaster Evening News, the Sheffield Morning Telegraph, the whole Daily Mail. In total, about 10 different newspapers over a period of 20 years before he got a proper job on Fleet Street, or rather on a Fleet Street newspaper. He was the Midlands correspondent at the Daily Telegraph. And he would turn in his grave at the thought of me standing here tonight in support of the notion that press needs to be regulated. So I'm sorry, Dad. But the world has changed since we lost you. And one thing Dad was very good at explaining to me is where that change occurred. And so that's where I'm planning on beginning tonight. That's another reason why I shouldn't have accepted this invitation, is that the more I've dug into it, and the more I've thought about it, and the more I've tried to research some of the things that I took to be true, the more I felt like, and this may alienate some of the older members of the audience, but I felt that actually it probably alienate most of the younger members of the audience as well. Unless you're more or less 46 3/4, consider yourself proud to be alienated. But in the 1980s, there was this wonderful craze called Magic Eye, where you'd have books. They looked like colouring books, but they weren't. The idea was that if you stared for long enough at this collection of squiggles and apparently random shapes, then eventually, if you could do this thing with your eyes that I never quite got the hang of, a fully formed image would appear as a form of optical illusion in the background of this apparently random set of squiggles. So you'd see a train coming towards you, or an aeroplane, or a tiger, or a lion. And the more I've tried to address this question here, how has this happened? How has this crisis in democracy been not just permitted, but actively encouraged by a profession that should be diametrically opposed to everything it represents? And how has fake news contributed to the successful Brexit vote? The more I felt like I'm looking at one of those pictures again. Every now and then, as I go through the history of coverage from Brussels by British newspapers, or I look at some of the fatuous slogans that have assumed an utterly unwarranted place in in the public discourse. I stare, and every now and then I think I glimpse a train, and I think, oh God, yeah, that key, and then it's gone again. So I don't know that anyone's going to walk out of this room tonight absolutely equipped with a full and definitive account of why what's happened has happened and how what's happened has been permitted to happen. But I hope at least to give you a few pointers. So 20 years after joining the Shipley Times and Express, Dad took the job as the Midlands correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. And this was my introduction to journalism. It was all I ever knew, really, and it was all I ever wanted to be. I grew up hearing him on the phone, filing copy. Sometimes it would take 90 minutes of reading down the phone everything he'd written for the next day's newspaper, putting in the punctuation marks, dealing with subs queries. And we also lived in a house where the phone would ring all the time. Nothing says anti-elite, like earning the Brits. But the Telegraph at the time was a paragon of objectivity. The editor was Bill Deeds, who I think rightly assumed legendary status in Fleet Street law, even if he hadn't been the subject of Evening War's scoop. And Dad would get calls from everyone. I think younger journalists, certainly journalism students, will find this almost impossible to believe. There are still a handful in the game who don't pick a side and then furiously defend it or attack the other side. But for my dad and for his generation, journalism was all about objectivity. So during the miners' strike, for example, our phone would ring, I would pick it up, I was quite precocious. I was quite irritating. Can I say 6242, what? And at the other end of the phone would be, it's Arthur Scarborough there, is your dad around? And I knew Arthur Scarborough was famous, so I was quite impressed by this. But then, an hour later, the phone would ring again, and it would be the head of the National Coal Board, McGregor, who was ringing with his version of events. And Dad would scrupulously report both of them, so that the reader was completely equipped with both sides of an argument, offered up objectively and factually for the benefit of the reader, because forewarned is forearmed. Knowledge is power. I should tell you, actually, for the journalism students in the room, my Uncle Martin got much more exciting when we were growing up. He was the football correspondent for the News of the World in the northwest of England. When I would occasionally answer the phone at their house in Stockport, because I spent a lot of summers with them, it wouldn't be Arthur Scargill at the other end of the phone, or Lord Carrington, or someone like that. It would be Ian Flipping Rush or Kenny Dalby. Many were the times I asked Dad that I couldn't have gone into football journalism instead of having a particular speciality for industrial relations, which at the time were meat and drink to Fleet Street, the car industry, and the miners' strike were probably the two areas in which he worked most. And he started there in 1975, as I said, 20 years after he left the Shipley Times and Express. 5 or 6 years after that, by his recollection, something began to change on Fleet Street. Because prior to that, the PAC, the group of journalists representing all of the major national titles, all of whom then had a Birmingham office, they all had a proper Midlands representation. It was a few more years before Max Hastings, the then editor of the Telegraph, decided in his wisdom that the second city of these islands didn't actually need a dedicated journalist in situ, but that's a conversation for a different day. What that explained to me was that something shifted in the PAC. So the Daily Star, believe it or not, was still a relatively respectable title back then. Today was up and running. The newspapers that you'll be familiar with now, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Times, the Telegraph, the Daily Mirror, the Guardian, they all reported the same story. And they might have done so with a modicum of, well, there'd be differences, wouldn't there? The Guardian would probably use longer words than the Daily Star, for example, but they wouldn't use different facts. They wouldn't use different realities. They wouldn't report different realities. And Dad said it was, and they were all mates, remember, in competition but also in cooperation. So while you dreamt of getting a scoop that nobody else got, there was always that trade-off of making sure everybody knew what everybody else was doing, so that you didn't get a monstering from the news desk but for not having got the story. And it was in the early 80s, he said, when the Sun started reporting these stories in a way that none of the rest of the pack recognised. And it was best described, under his account, as a story written in a way that was designed to elicit the biggest emotional response from the reader. That bears some thinking about, because it leads directly to written in 2018. The biggest emotional response from a reader is not necessarily going to be provided by telling the reader the truth, or even giving the reader the dull detail, the story that is from a horse's mouth that is actually not going to frighten the horses. And it was the Sun that did this. And there's a little quote from the disgraced former editor of the Sun at around this period, when he was challenged by a colleague on why the newspaper that he edited didn't concentrate more on serious news, that I think is very pertinent. And this is going back to the early 80s, which is, I think, where the journey to here probably begins. It contains a rather offensive word for people of colour, so I will apologise for that in advance, but I think it's important to say the word out loud, because this is the attitude that has been allowed since Rupert Murdoch bought the Sun and toppled the Daily Mirror's dominance in the market. This is precisely the sort of attitude that has been allowed to infiltrate the public discourse and do, for my money, untold damage to the population. I'm speaking, of course, about Kelvin Mackenzie. You just don't understand the readers, do you, eh? He's the bloke you see in the pub, a right old fascist, wants to send the wogs back, buy his poxy council house. He's afraid of the unions, afraid of the Russians, hates the queers and the weirdos and the drug dealers. He doesn't want to hear about that stuff being serious news. And in a way, he was right. Except there's a real chicken and egg conundrum here, because the Daily Mirror that he toppled, the Daily Mirror that Larry Lamb, his predecessor at the Sun, and Rupert Murdoch, his proprietor, took on and defeated, was a tabloid populist newspaper that believed in people. The best example of that, I think, is the fact that if you are familiar with sort of low-level boating, water sports, there's a dinghy called a Mirror, which I was aware of. You know, it goes to the seaside a bit in North Norfolk, and they've still got Mirror dinghies on the quayside. And astonishingly, when I looked into this, partly through the autobiography of a former Mirror executive, that was a newspaper promotion. You actually collected the tokens, saved them up, and you bought a little boat that you could strap to the top of your car and drive to the seaside and sail. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later, you're collecting tokens to get a ferry to Calais and stock up on dirt cheap booze. And that seems to me to be emblematic of the values of those two newspapers. And the Sun won, because Kelvin Mackenzie's dismal, disappointing and very rude description of the British people gained traction and gained commercial success. So the enemy's changed, that's all, not the rhetoric, not the philosophy. You could read this again. He's the bloke you see in the pub, a right old fascist, wants to, and then you could just change what the enemies are. The point is, he decided what these people's enemies were. The unions. How can the unions be an enemy of the working people of this country? And yet, I grew up, Margaret Thatcher, I was 7 when Margaret Thatcher came to power, I grew up persuaded that the unions were an enemy of the working people of this country, because even by then, it had filtered into the mainstream of media coverage, newspaper coverage, to such a degree that it went almost unchallenged. I'll give you a quick example of how dodgy that is. Again, it speaks to the Brexit story. 2 newspapers. Kindly pointed out that I worked for the Daily Express during a curious experiment in social liberalism. But it's fair to say that the Daily Express and the Daily Mail have done more than any other newspaper, except of course the Sun, to demonise immigration and to provide the notion to people who ended up voting for Brexit that immigration as a result of European Union membership would somehow diminish their lives, or more pertinently, emptied their wage packets. So those 2 newspapers in 2017, 2016, just prior even to the referendum, 2015, were edited and owned by men who, I would argue, have done more damage to the social infrastructure of this country than the Luftwaffe did to the material infrastructure of this country. And I'll give you an example of why. I worked for the Daily Express before Richard Desmond bought it. After Richard Desmond bought it, he flirted with the Labour Party. I think he gave them a bunch of money. Then he flirted with the Tories, and he still hadn't got a night, so he ended up flirting with UKIP. During the course of this process, the Daily Express reported routinely and regularly that British workers were having their wages driven down by immigration. It was the main reason why they weren't earning as much as they thought they should have been earning. These were stories written by my friends and former colleagues on the Daily Express, to whom I pay no goodwill because they have bills to pay, and he who pays the piper calls the tune. But this was a deliberate proprietorial slant introduced by the owner of the newspaper. I haven't got the numbers in front of me, so forgive me if I'm out by 10 or 15 million or so. But over the course of this period, Richard Desmond took about £170 million out of the Daily Express, while the journalists writing stories about how immigration was driving down the wages of British workers didn't get a pay rise for 8 or 9 years. So the journalists whose own wages had been frozen, not just tied to inflation, but actually in real terms cut, because they didn't go up in line with inflation. They are writing stories about other workers having their wages driven down by immigration, while their own wages are literally being driven down by a proprietor who has taken hundreds of millions of pounds out of a once thriving business. Where does that leave the readers? In complete darkness. Let's cross London. Let's move from what remains of Fleet Street to Kensington, where the Daily Mail was until very recently edited by a man called Paul Dacre. Paul Dacre routinely takes between £1.5 and £2 million gross salary out of the Daily Mail, and also, as you know, is very fond of propagating the idea that wages are being driven down by immigrants. Now, a couple of years ago, after the referendum result, there was a little whisper. You probably have read about it in the Guardian, but there was a little whisper that the cleaners of associated newspapers on Derry Street in Kensington were contemplating industrial action. Now, these are the kind of things that make my ears prick up. They're the kind of things that would have made my late father's ears prick up, but they're not the kind of things that you're going to read about in newspapers these days. And I'll tell you why. Because they did threaten industrial action. They were on less than the London living wage, these cleaners. They were on relative peanuts. So say £7.50 an hour. The man earning £1.7 million a year was having his desk cleaned every morning by a man earning £7 an hour or £7.50 an hour. And still his newspaper printed stories about how immigrants were driving down wages, and with a nod to the disgraced former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, how the trade unions were somehow the enemy of the working man and woman. So they threatened industrial action, and the fear of a PR disaster meant that they got a rather generous pay rise. The agency that contracted the cleaners to the Daily Mail suddenly had a completely random change of heart that, according to the official record, had absolutely nothing to do with the threat of industrial action. They just woke up one morning and, like Ebenezer Scrooge, no doubt, as a result, horribly decided to suddenly pay these people a decent wage. All of those people were foreign. All of them were immigrants. They got a pay rise by exercising the powers of collective bargaining. They got a pay rise by uniting, cooperating, and demanding. And after they got the pay rise, I hope this doesn't come as a surprise to anybody in the room, after they got that pay rise, they were still foreign. They were still immigrants in the Daily Mail. So it's not the game that's changed, it's just the enemies. And we're getting closer now to Brexit. I'll read you another quote, I don't have a name. It's the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it's always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it's a democracy, a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament, or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them that they are being attacked, and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism, and exposing the country to greater danger. Now that is pretty much, if you cast the newspaper proprietors in the role of the leaders, and some politicians, but by no means all, although oddly, I think the two most prominent and successful politicians on that side of the Brexit debate were actually former journalists, Michael Gove and Boris Johnson. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked, and denounce the pacifists or the remoteness for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to greater danger. That's not Kelvin Mackenzie or Paul Dacre. That's Hermann Goering, who was speaking at the Nuremberg trials, not at his own trial. It was a comment he made to somebody who was covering it. So for fact checkers among them, it wasn't said at his own trial in Nuremberg, but it was said during the Nuremberg trials. And that really got me thinking, because it's so true. If you tell people they are being attacked, and you offer them a solution to that attack, an escape route from that attack, then reaching for it doesn't make them racist. It doesn't make them bigoted. It doesn't make them stupid. It does, however, make them wrong. And that seems to be where the light, the chink opened up in the approach to Brexit. Because people being wrong were not being told they were wrong. And the reason they weren't being told they were wrong was because newspapers, as a business model, as a commercial reality, were shifting a lot more copies and wielding a lot more power by frightening people than they would be by informing them. I think that goes back to the shift in the country's discourse that occurred when the Sun overcame the Daily Mirror, and the notion of frightening and exciting an emotional response replaced the notion of informing and providing an evidence-based story to your reader. So what became the new enemy? No prizes for guessing what I think. The European Union became the new enemy. So after Kelvin Mackenzie had moved on from the unions and the weirdos and the drug dealers and sundry other insults, he happened upon at least three new demons that the tabloid press in this country were keen to persuade us were lurking under every bed and around every corner. And I'd like to think about the words here, because it seems to me that we've forgotten to ask people what words mean. We've forgotten to insist that people who use words blithely and casually can actually account for what those words mean. I'll leap ahead a little bit and give you an example of people using words all the time without being asked what they mean, and it would be the Prime Minister, who now has adopted that ludicrous mantra of taking back control of our laws and our money and our borders. We'll have a look in a second at what she means by control, what she means by laws, what she means by borders, and what she means by money. But let's instead look at how that started, how you could be persuaded as a reader of a newspaper that something that was actively good for you was in fact your enemy and something you should vote against. I'll give you health and safety to start with. Think about it. What do we want? Less safety. How does that work? What do we want again? Less health. Really? Every single right-wing newspaper columnist of the last 30 years has at some point tilted at health and safety as an enemy of the interests of the readers. Health and safety legislation, of course, is simply an obstacle or an inconvenience for bosses who don't care about their workers' welfare. Health and safety legislation enshrined in European law and therefore, of course, brought into British law, was mostly written by us. But again, you'll never read that in the Daily Mail, or the Sun, or the Express, or the Telegraph. It was essentially, like the single market, a British invention. But British newspapers were persuading British people that any attempt to introduce more health and more safety was somehow a bad thing. And it worked. Because I fell for it. You know, I've laughed at high-vis jackets and thought, well, that's a bit ridiculous. And then I've gone to other countries and I've seen somebody on a construction site 200 foot up in the air, not wearing a helmet. And I thought, you know what, maybe health and safety legislation might be about it. Two more words. Within Europe, dreamt of and described by everybody from Winston Churchill right through to Margaret Thatcher in 1975. How did that ever get portrayed to us and the British public as a bad thing? And yet it did. And at risk of repetition, I remind you of some of Kelvin Mackenzie's greatest hits once again. Up yours, yours. Great front page. You see where it leads. And it's not just him. I've got a list here of stories. You can find them online. You can find them on my Twitter account. These are all published, and they're not confined to the Sun. They're not confined to the Times. They're not, well, they wouldn't be at the Times, but they're not confined to the cheaper prints, as we used to call them. They're just as likely to have popped up in my dad's old paper. And I could pick these almost at random. I could also probably have spared you all the speech and just stood in front of you reading them one by one and listening to the crescendo of laughter build until you suddenly realise that actually this is what passes for news in Britain in 2018. And at that point, most of them have probably stopped laughing. English Channel to be renamed Anglo-French Pont. Daily Mail published it. EU to ban selling eggs by the dozen. Daily Mail published it. UK to be forced to adopt continental two-pin plug. Daily Star, Daily Mail. Brussels to force EU flag on England shirts. Daily Mail. EU orders farmers to give toys to pigs. That was in the Times. The Times, Thunderer, the newspaper of record. Firemen's poles outlawed by EU. Euro ban on food waste means swans cannot be fed. That was in the Observer. Do you see how it infected every area of Fleet Street? But we'll jump the gun again. Because in the early 80s, Calvin Mackenzie arrived at the Sun and started doing untold damage. In the early 90s, another journalist, who barely deserves the description, he arrived in Brussels as the correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. His name was Boris Johnson. He took the job at the Daily Telegraph after being fired from the traineeship at the Times for making up a quote from his own job file. That, to me, should perhaps have sounded some alarms about the future reliability, decency and integrity of the man, but he moves in circles where reliability, decency and integrity seem to be increasingly undervalued attributes. And when he got to Brussels, he realised, despite having lived there as a child, when his father was an MEP, he realised that the best way to bring himself to the attention of editors at the Daily Telegraph was to do what he described as throwing rocks over the garden wall and rejoicing in the sound of greenhouse panes of glass smashing on the other side. So he would start filing back from Brussels the stories that lead us to a Fleet Street, to a newspaper industry that considers it commonplace to now publish stories. EU tells Welsh how to grow their leaves. It gets better. EU tells women to hand in worn-out sex toys. British rhubarb to be straight. EU to ban rocking horses. Scotch whisky rebranded as a dangerous chemical by EU. Brussels ban on pints of shandy. High up signs to be put on mountain. This is the BBC. That was the BBC. So this utterly uninterrupted avalanche of misinformation, designed not to persuade us ultimately to act against our own interests, not to persuade us ultimately to become the first country in history to vote to impose economic sanctions upon itself, as we did 2.5 years ago. There was no master plan, I don't believe. There was no conspiracy. There was just a bunch of journalists who didn't have my dad's background, who didn't have my dad's dedication to objectivity, evidence and truth, but had instead ambition and very little else. And they realised that their ambition was more likely to be advanced by soliciting the sort of response that these stories got from the colonels, from the letters page, and therefore from the news editor, and therefore from the editor. And so they kept coming. Bosses to be told what colour carpets to buy by EU. EU says British yoghurt must be renamed fermented milk pudding. EU to ban zips on trousers. EU to ban 16-year-olds from using Facebook. Strawberries must be oval. EU orders swings to be pulled down. Tea bags banned from being recycled. British laugh to be replaced with Euro news. And I could go on. I mean, I really could go on. I could probably go on for about a day and a half and not even scratch the surface of the misinformation and lies that Boris Johnson, Calvin Mackenzie, Paul Dacre and their fellow travellers have completely polluted public discourse with. But it's the BBC that's most interesting there, because the BBC is not supposed to have fallen into these traps. It's supposed to have risen above the fray and delivered instead proper objective journalism, but it doesn't. My contention is that the newspapers have so completely subverted what would once have been universally agreed, that the BBC has fallen into this dreadful trap of false equivalence and sort of false impartiality that again explains why I think democracy is in crisis. These days, if the BBC were to conduct a commemoration of the death of John F. Kennedy, it would not surprise me if they decided that for balance they needed to have somebody in the studio who thinks he's still alive. If we were to go back a few hundred years and bring the BBC's rules about balance and impartiality to the table at the time of Galileo Galilei, then I could imagine when I was presenting Newsnight, having Galileo Galilei on one side with his telescope and his charts of the sky and his pretty incontrovertible proof that the Earth revolves around the Sun and not the other way around. But then, of course, with my BBC hat on, I'd have to say thank you very much, Signor Galilei. I'd have to turn here to Mr. Nigelo Norsini, who has absolutely no telescope. He's never really looked at the sky, but he's just got a feeling that it's all wrong, and he's written a book saying why, from his exile house in France, he's absolutely persuaded that Galileo's got all this wrong, and things were much better in the olden days when we never even looked at stars and worried about the planets and just went to church and said our prayers and thank you very much, good night. That gets the equal weight, the equal balance, the equal importance, the equal status to the science. So last month I had Sir Paul Nurse in my studio, my radio show. Sir Paul Nurse has won a Nobel Prize. That, I think we can still all agree, is a fairly good indicator of being quite good at science. He spent 50 years as a research scientist. He was in my studio to tell me about the impact upon research science that no deal Brexit would have. I don't know when we became a country that needs to balance out the opinion of a Nobel Prize winning scientist with 50 years on the clock with the thoughts of somebody like Andrew Bridgen or Nadine Dorries. But that is what we have become. And still these people appear on television screens because still the BBC subscribes to the notion that there are two sides to every story, and still this ludicrous obsession with impartiality and balance, even in the face of science, climate change, vaccines, not just Brexit, even in the face of science, the idea that you have to have a dissenting voice is now hardwired into the DNA of the corporation. Andrew Bridgen, of course, recently opined that because he was English, he believed he was entitled to an Irish passport. Nadine Dorries famously took to WhatsApp and the ERG's group on there to ask if someone could please explain to her what the customs union was, because she kept losing arguments with people about why it was definitely the right thing to leave. I'm not laughing anymore. It should be on telly again tomorrow. He'll be on the Today program. They'll all be popping up, still making arguments that are based on, we now know, nonsense. And where did it lead once that result came in? It led to 3 front pages of the Daily Mail. Paul Dacre, of course, the great defender of British values, the man who in his own mind has done more to protect this country from Johnny Foreigner than anybody since Winston Churchill. No, scratch that. Anybody since Booting. Crush the saboteurs. Crush the saboteurs. Front page, mass market, daily newspaper, describing MPs determined to exercise their sovereign right to represent their voters as saboteurs, but worse, not just saboteurs, saboteurs who needed to be crushed. If that was North Korea, we would laugh at that sort of journalism, but now we're so groomed to find it normal, we barely batted an eyelid. Enemies of the people. This great defender of British values has got a problem with a sovereign parliament, and democratically elected MPs moved on to High Court judges with the enemies of the people front page. High Court judges. The enemies of the people. An independent functioning judiciary and the rule of law. Enemies of the people. So this great doughty defender of British values has got a problem with our sovereign parliament, our democratically elected parliamentary representatives, the rule of law, and an independent judiciary. There aren't many British values left, if you want to get constitutional about it, but I put academic freedom on this. The freedom of academics to research, teach, learn, proselytise about the fruits of their academic efforts. Not Paul Dacre. Our Remainer universities was the front page he elected, because how dare they exercise independent freedom of thought and arrive at a conclusion that's different from the one I've been telling everyone for 30 years must be true, despite the fact that I, Paul Dacre, have no evidence at all to back up my position. But that's normal. And you'll book a columnist from the Daily Mail to come into the studio and do a conversation with somebody who might be a scientist. So they get equal weight, they get equal balance. And that's Fox News. We just didn't realise. So when fake news started in America and we thought we were somehow different from it or insulated from it, we weren't. Because we had it all along. We'd had the Daily Telegraph, latterly, but we had the Sun, the Kelvin Mackenzie, we had the Daily Mail under Paul Dacre, we had all of these people peddling their nonsense and their lies, unchecked, unchallenged, and utterly unscrutinised for the best part of 3.5 decades. When Roger Ailes left Fox News, or when he passed away, there was a little flutter on social media in America of young people describing how Fox News had ruined their families. And they couldn't go home at Christmas anymore because they would fight so furiously with their parents. Or if they went to visit their grandma, they'd ask why she'd buried all her jewellery in the back garden, only to be told that she had been convinced that Barack Obama was personally going to come around her house and steal it by a Fox News contributor. Same thing happened with the Daily Mail. I'm taking calls from people now for 2 or 3 years, particularly in the run-up to Christmas, who would argue that the Daily Mail has wrecked my family. It's rotted my grandmother's brain. I cannot have a conversation with my mother, who lives in rural Worcestershire, and couldn't really be less affected by multiculturalism, diversity, immigration, or, as I prefer to call it, modernity. But she's utterly persuaded that the barbarians are at the gate and she's top of their hit list, these people tell me. It's funny, you know, speaking about rural Worcestershire, of the 6 people who've given the Leveson Lecture, 2 of them grew up on Hertford Road in Kidderminster. Just a sort of trivia for a pub quiz 30 years from now. Tom Watson's mum and my mum used to chew the fat over the tills of the local Sainsbury's. So that's somehow where we've ended up. If you think I'm exaggerating, just consider this. Those three phrases that I said I would return to. We can't control our money, our borders, and our laws. Put your hand up if you are familiar with Article 7 of the EU Citizens' Rights Directive. Don't be shy. Would you have had it up in May 2016? Nor would I. It was my job. Article 7 of the EU Citizens' Rights Directive states that in order to come to any member state without a job, you must first demonstrate that you have sufficient resources to ensure you don't become a burden on the social assistance service of the host country. You can demand that they provide evidence of material wealth sufficient to ensure that they won't become a burden. You can also put a 3-month time limit on their search for work. I didn't know that. We can't control our borders. She's still saying it. She said it in the House of Commons today. And the truth is, we always could. Successive governments elected not to. And if you had to, off the top of your head, think of a Home Secretary who tried to make much political capital out of whipping up a bit of jingoism and xenophobia, I suggest that the initials TM would be fairly high up on your list, so she knows. And not just the borders. We can't control our borders. We can't control our money either. Okay, next time you see her being interviewed, it won't be by me. Wonder why no one asks her what money it is that we can't control. She is presumably referring to the contribution we make to the European Union budget, which in 2016, according to the Office of National Statistics, was £9.4 billion. The EU Commission has it lower. They have it at £8.1 billion because they do their sums slightly differently. So we'll go with a higher figure. This is the money that we can't control. She's still saying it now. She said it to the Commons today. £181 million a week that we can't control, even though we choose to send it to the European Union. How is that not in control? What percentage do you think it is of the overall government expenditure for 2016? 1.2%. We can't control our borders, except we can. We can't control our money. What, you mean the 1.2% of overall government spending that we choose to exercise our control to contribute to the overall EU budget? What do you think it is per person per day? You know how fond these tabloid newspapers are of really nifty little statistics that get under the bonnet of a more complicated story. 39 pence per person per day. And still, when you speak to people clinging desperately to the carcass of Brexit and pretending that it's still a unicorn about to become revivified any minute now, still they'll tell you it's all about the money, except it isn't. Control our borders. Control our money. Not the Prime Minister, not a newspaper. And finally, control our laws, which has become a bit of a hobby horse of mine. Because when people tell me that they can't control our laws or they can't wait to leave the European Union because of all the laws that have been imposed upon us from without and which we are powerless to resist, I have one very, very simple question to ask them. And I've been asking it for 10 years. Name one. Name a law. Name a law that in April of next year you are going to be dancing in the streets because you no longer have to obey it. EU Copyright Directive. There's loads, James. Absolutely loads. Every area of my life is policed and crushed and squeezed by these dreadful laws. Name one. Go on, just name one. And after a giggle and a sigh and a pause, an uncomfortable silence, usually somebody will mention bendy bananas. Which brings us back to Boris Johnson. Who invented that story. And who has lied and lied and lied again to his employers, to his party leaders, to his wives, to his mistresses, to his constituents, to every member of this country. And still he lies. £100,000 he picked up this weekend to deliver a lecture to hedge funds, and I puzzled over that. But I know why they're paying that sort of money. Not because he's trustworthy, but because he's got an angle on what might happen next. He's so immersed in British politics that integrity, decency and honesty aside, he's worth paying money to, because if you're in the business of making money out of markets moving or out of countries declining, you want to know what he's got planned. You want to know what he's thinking. If you're going to make £100 million out of the pound tanking on the morning after the Brexit referendum or on the morning after the actual departure from the European Union, you want him close. You want to know what he's up to. but he's got no business. He's got no business at all continuing to peddle the lies, the misinformation and the divisive nonsense. Turkey. Got a Turkish grandfather. A Turkish grandfather. He thought nothing of portraying every single resident of Turkey as a potential rapist or terrorist who'd be arriving in London on the next Eurostar if we voted to leave the European Union. So, in conclusion, I don't know what the answer is, sorry. But I know what the question is. It's a question we have to start asking. We have to start asking it now. The question is, how the hell did we let this happen to our islands? How the hell did we let our country get reduced into a mewling, fighting, snarling cesspit of utterly entrenched division, while in fact our common interest was best served all along by human rights, health and safety, the European Union. Thank you very much.